There comes a day when silence stops protecting evil. There comes a moment when manipulation no longer delays consequence. There comes a reckoning not driven by anger, not fueled by revenge, but summoned by moral law itself. That day is not announced with thunder. It arrives quietly, firmly, and without appeal. This is Reckoning Day. And for the narcissist who refused correction, it does not pass lightly. Reckoning Day. When consequences arrive, Reckoning Day does not mean chaos. It does not mean public humiliation. And it certainly does not mean personal vengeance. Reckoning Day is the moment when consequences finally catch up to patterns that have long evaded accountability. For years, narcissistic behavior often appears untouchable. The lies seem to work. The manipulation seems effective. The charm disarms suspicion, and the victim is left wondering whether justice exists at all. But reckoning is not delayed forever. It is restrained until restraint would become injustice. What many do not understand is this: Reckoning Day is not triggered by one mistake. It is triggered by persistence in wrongdoing. It comes when warnings are ignored, when correction is mocked, when humility is rejected, and when that threshold is crossed, consequences no longer negotiate. And when Reckoning Day arrives, the outcome is never singular, it multiplies. Double karma. Why the consequences multiply? Double karma does not come from cruelty. It comes from persistence in moral refusal. In both spiritual law and psychological reality, consequences are never random. They are cumulative. They build quietly, patiently, often invisibly until the weight becomes impossible to hold. The narcissist is not brought down by a single wrongdoing. They are brought down by repetition without repentance. There is a profound difference between failure and defiance. Failure acknowledges limits. Defiance challenges order. The narcissist does not simply make mistakes. They repeatedly override conscience, distort truth, and justify harm long after they have been warned. And they are always warned. Sometimes the warning comes as discomfort, a subtle unease, a sense that relationships feel strained, that trust is thinning, that people are pulling back. These moments are not punishment. They are invitations, invitations to reflect, to pause, to correct course. But narcissism interprets warning as insult. Instead of listening, the narcissist explains. Instead of repairing, they rationalize. Instead of repenting, they strategize. This is the moment when karma begins to multiply. Double karma emerges when wrongdoing becomes intentional rather than impulsive, when harm is no longer accidental but calculated, when manipulation is no longer reactive but systematic. Each choice compounds the moral debt, not because God is eager to punish, but because moral law cannot be indefinitely violated without response. In Christian understanding, mercy always precedes judgment. Grace creates space for change. But grace misused does not cancel justice, it intensifies it. Many narcissists survive for years under the illusion of immunity. Others forgive, victims endure, communities hesitate, they mistake restraint for approval, silence for agreement, mercy for permission. But mercy is never permission. When grace is exploited, accountability increases. This is why consequences eventually arrive in layers. Not all at once, but with precision. Loss follows loss. Exposure follows denial. Collapse follows control. The narcissist often believes the double in double karma means excess. In truth, it means completion. The first consequence was meant to correct. The second arrives because correction was refused. This is why Reckoning Day feels sudden to the narcissist, but inevitable to moral order. They are shocked not because justice is unfair, but because they assumed it would never arrive. Double karma also reflects a deeper violation, the misuse of power. Narcissistic harm is rarely isolated. It involves influence, persuasion, distortion of reality. It leaves confusion in its wake. And moral law responds most firmly when power is abused to suppress truth. This is why consequences extend beyond one area of life. Reputation, relationships, stability, health. None exist in isolation when the core self has been built on deception. Double karma is not vengeance. It is correction without compromise. It is the restoration of balance after prolonged distortion. It is the end of exemption. And once this process begins, it does not reverse through excuses, charm, or image repair. Because karma that has multiplied is no longer negotiating behavior, it is dismantling a system that refused to change. Before these consequences fully unfold, however, there were always signs, warning signs they ignored when mercy spoke first. No reckoning arrives without warning. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about justice. Before consequences fall, before exposure happens, before loss multiplies, there is always a quieter phase, one that does not punish, but invites correction. In Christian language, this is mercy. In psychological terms, it is feedback. In life itself, it is restraint. The narcissist is never struck down without notice. They are warned repeatedly, patiently, unmistakably. The first warning is internal. It begins as discomfort, a subtle unease they cannot quite explain. Sleep becomes restless, thoughts loop, anxiety surfaces without a clear cause. They begin to feel watched, not by people, but by reality itself. Their nervous system senses that something is misaligned. This is not fear of consequences yet. It is the conscience attempting to surface. But narcissism does not tolerate discomfort well. Instead of asking, "What am I doing wrong?" the narcissist asks, "Who is threatening my control?" The second warning is relational. People begin to pull back, not dramatically, but intuitively. Conversations shorten, trust thins. The emotional access they once had is no longer freely given. There is a subtle shift in how others respond. Again, this is not punishment. It is protection. Healthy systems withdraw from dysfunction. Boundaries emerge naturally when exploitation has gone too far. These relational signals are invitations to reflect, to repair, to take responsibility. But narcissism interprets distance as disrespect. Instead of repair, they escalate contact. Instead of humility, they seek leverage. Instead of listening, they gather information. The third warning is exposure anxiety. They begin to fear being found out. Paranoia sets in. They watch reactions closely. They scan for signs that their narrative is slipping. They may accuse others of betrayal or disloyalty without evidence. This is the stage where the narcissist senses judgment approaching, but still misunderstands its purpose. Judgment is not arriving to destroy them. It is arriving to stop the damage. But narcissism does not respond to judgment with repentance. It responds with control. They start tightening narratives, rewriting history, recruiting allies, discrediting those who no longer comply. They tell themselves these actions are necessary for survival. This is the most critical moment. At this stage, the outcome is still reversible. Stopping would still change everything. But stopping requires humility, and humility threatens the narcissistic identity. So the warnings are ignored. They dismiss their anxiety as someone else's fault. They label boundaries as cruelty. They interpret silence as manipulation. This is where mercy gives way to inevitability. In Scripture, warning ignored leads to hardening. In psychology, feedback ignored leads to escalation. In life, signals dismissed lead to collapse. The pattern is universal. Warnings are not designed to frighten. They are designed to interrupt. But when interruption is rejected, consequence becomes the only remaining teacher. This is why Reckoning Day feels shocking to the narcissist, not because it came without notice, but because they refused to believe it applied to them. They believed consequences were for others. They believed accountability was negotiable. They believed charm could override truth indefinitely. And when the warnings finally stop, it is not because danger has passed. It is because the lesson has shifted phases. Silence from mercy always precedes action from justice. Once warnings are ignored long enough, they no longer repeat. They transform. The gentle internal signals become unavoidable external consequences. The quiet relational distance becomes permanent separation. The anxiety about exposure becomes actual exposure. And by the time Reckoning Day arrives, it is no longer asking the narcissist to change. It is ending their ability to continue. That refusal to heed warning does not just invite exposure, it triggers the unraveling of the very control they depended on. Exposure, when lies collapse, exposure is not an event. It is a process. One of the greatest misconceptions about justice is the belief that truth arrives suddenly, loudly, and dramatically. In reality, exposure unfolds slowly, almost quietly, as lies begin to contradict one another under their own weight. Deception can survive pressure. It cannot survive consistency. Every narcissistic system depends on distortion. Stories are adjusted depending on the audience. Facts are edited for advantage. Memory is rewritten to preserve innocence. For a time, this works especially when people are trusting, forgiving, or unwilling to confront discomfort. But distortion requires constant maintenance. Each lie demands another. Each manipulation creates a fracture. Each false narrative increases the strain on the structure, holding it together. Exposure begins when that structure weakens. People start noticing inconsistencies, not because they are hunting for truth, but because reality keeps surfacing. Accounts no longer align. Behavior no longer matches words. Promises dissolve. Explanations change. This is not an attack. It is alignment. Truth does not need defenders to prevail. It only needs time. The narcissist often believes exposure comes from enemies. In truth, it comes from patterns becoming visible. No single person unmasks them. Their own repetition does. And when exposure begins, it does not announce itself. It whispers. A question that lingers too long. A pause where trust once lived. A hesitation that did not exist before. These moments accumulate. The narcissist senses this shift before anyone names it. Anxiety intensifies. Control strategies increase. They attempt to manage perception, tightening narratives, recruiting voices, discrediting dissent. But exposure accelerates when control escalates. The more aggressively the narcissist defends the image, the more obvious the distortion becomes. Defensive behavior raises suspicion. Over-explanation invites scrutiny. Manipulation reveals itself through excess. This is the paradox of deception. The effort to preserve it hastens its collapse. Exposure is devastating not because secrets are revealed, but because credibility dissolves. Once trust is broken, even truth spoken later is doubted. Once integrity is questioned, every action is reinterpreted. The narcissist does not lose everything at once. They lose the benefit of belief. People stop giving the benefit of the doubt. They stop excusing patterns. They stop protecting the narrative. And when belief is withdrawn, influence evaporates. This is why exposure feels like betrayal to the narcissist. They confuse accountability with disloyalty. They believe others are required to maintain the illusion indefinitely, but no one is obligated to uphold deception, especially when it harms others. From a moral perspective, exposure is not cruelty. It is containment. It prevents further damage. It interrupts cycles of harm. It restores clarity to confused environments. In Christian understanding, exposure is not humiliation. It is light, and light does not destroy by intention. It reveals by nature. Darkness cannot coexist with it. What collapses during exposure is not merely reputation. It is authority built on falsehood. The narcissist may still speak. They may still explain. They may still accuse, but their words no longer carry weight. This is the moment they fear most, not being seen as wrong, but being seen as unreliable. Once unreliability is established, the systems that sustain them begin to withdraw support. People distance themselves not out of vengeance, but discernment. Institutions step back not to punish, but to protect. Opportunities close not out of malice, but necessity. Exposure is the beginning of reckoning because it removes the mask without requiring confrontation. No argument is needed. No verdict is announced. Reality speaks for itself. And once exposure has occurred, control can no longer be reclaimed through manipulation. The tools that once worked now fail. The narratives that once persuaded now repel. What remains is the truth, unaltered, unamused, immovable. And when exposure removes the illusion, the narcissist is left facing something far more terrifying than public judgment, the irreversible loss of control. Loss of control. The real fear. What the narcissist fears most is not judgment. It is not exposure. It is not even loss. What they fear above all else is loss of control. This is the truth many people misunderstand. They assume narcissists are driven by pride, reputation, or power itself. But beneath all of it lies something far more fragile, the need to regulate reality through other people. Control is not optional for the narcissist. It is oxygen. They need reactions to confirm existence. They need emotional responses to validate significance. They need influence over perception to sustain identity. As long as they can provoke, confuse, or command attention, the internal structure holds. But when exposure begins to weaken belief, control starts slipping. The first sign is subtle. Their words no longer land the same way. Where they once provoked emotion, there is now restraint. Where explanations once reassured, they now raise questions. The audience that once reacted instinctively now pauses. This pause is devastating. Silence removes leverage. Distance removes dominance. Calm removes authority. When the person they once influenced no longer reacts, no longer explains, defends, or engages, the narcissist experiences something close to panic. Because reaction was never about relationship. It was about regulation. Without access to your emotional world, they lose their steering wheel. At this stage, the narcissist often escalates, not because they are cruel, but because they are destabilized. They may attempt renewed contact. They may provoke conflict. They may cycle between guilt, nostalgia, anger, and urgency. These are not expressions of love. They are attempts to restore control, and when escalation fails, fear sets in. This is the fear of irrelevance, the realization that their influence has ended, that the system they depended on no longer responds, that the tools they mastered no longer work. Control loss is not abstract. It is physiological. The nervous system reacts with agitation. Thoughts race. Sleep fractures. Anxiety spikes. The body registers threat, not because someone attacked them, but because the illusion of command has collapsed. In Christian moral understanding, this is the moment when idolatry is exposed. Control was never simply a habit, it was the object of devotion, and when that idol fails, disorientation follows. The narcissist may accuse others of cruelty at this stage. They may frame boundaries as punishment. They may claim abandonment or injustice. But what has truly happened is this: access has been revoked, not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Healthy systems cannot remain accessible to manipulation indefinitely. Boundaries emerge not to harm, but to stop harm. Loss of control feels catastrophic to the narcissist because it confronts them with a reality they have long avoided. They cannot force connection. They cannot command affection. They cannot coerce belief forever. And once this truth is encountered, desperation increases. They may attempt last efforts, grand gestures, sudden apologies, selective accountability, but these are often transactional, not transformational, designed to restore access, not to restore integrity. When these attempts fail, the narcissist faces an unbearable conclusion. They must exist without influence over others. This is where reckoning deepens. Because control was the scaffolding holding everything else together. Once it collapses, the internal system begins to unravel. Identity fragments, purpose dissolves, stability weakens. Loss of control is not the end of consequences, it is the doorway into them. It marks the moment when the narcissist can no longer manage outcomes, narratives, or reactions. The world stops bending, reality stops negotiating. And from this point forward, consequences no longer arrive as warnings. They arrive as corrections. When control is gone, the narcissist is left alone with the very inner collapse they spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Internal collapse, when the system turns inward. When control is gone, collapse does not arrive from the outside. It rises from within. This is the stage many never see, because it unfolds in private. There is no audience, no applause, no spectacle. Only the slow unraveling of an inner system that was never built on truth. For years, the narcissist managed tension by exporting it, projecting blame, provoking reactions, controlling narratives. But when access to others is revoked, there is nowhere left to send the pressure. It turns inward. The mind begins looping. The same thoughts repeat without resolution. Conversations replay. Outcomes are imagined and reimagined. Sleep fractures, not because of guilt alone, but because the nervous system no longer feels safe inside its own illusions. Anxiety becomes constant. Rest becomes elusive. The body carries what the mind refuses to integrate. This is not spiritual punishment. It is psychological consequence. A system built on distortion requires constant energy to maintain. When that energy source is cut, when reactions stop, when influence ends, the structure collapses under its own contradictions. The narcissist often experiences a profound restlessness at this stage. Stillness becomes intolerable. Silence feels threatening. They may seek distraction through substances, compulsive behaviors, or relentless busyness. Anything to avoid being alone with themselves, because solitude exposes the truth they have long avoided. There is no stable self beneath the performance. In Christian moral understanding, this is what happens when identity is built on control rather than character. When the external scaffolding is removed, there is nothing solid underneath to bear weight. The collapse is not dramatic. It is exhausting. Energy drains. Motivation weakens. The future feels vague and unstable. The confidence that once felt effortless now requires constant reinforcement, and even then, it does not hold. Relationships suffer further, not because others are cruel, but because the narcissist's inner chaos begins leaking outward. Irritability increases. Impulsivity rises. Judgment falters. The very behaviors that once secured admiration now repel connection. This stage often includes somatic symptoms, headaches, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, unexplained tension. The body, long used as a vehicle for performance, now becomes the messenger of truth. The body keeps score when the mind refuses to listen. What makes this collapse so destabilizing is that it cannot be solved through strategy. There is no manipulation that restores inner coherence. There is no narrative that resolves the contradiction. No audience that can stabilize identity. The narcissist may attempt to regain footing by returning to old patterns, seeking validation, provoking conflict, chasing admiration. But these attempts feel hollow. The relief is brief. The emptiness returns stronger. This is the consequence of a life spent avoiding integration. Internal collapse is not condemnation. It is exposure at the deepest level. It reveals the cost of living without accountability, the toll of suppressing conscience, the burden of sustaining an image that reality no longer supports. For those watching from the outside, this stage often goes unnoticed. There may be no public failure yet, no obvious loss, just a quiet deterioration that cannot be reversed through effort alone. And this is where moral law does its most precise work, because collapse forces confrontation not with others, but with oneself. It removes distractions, it strips defenses, it demands reckoning at the core. Some respond to this moment with humility. They slow down, they seek help. They accept responsibility, and for them, collapse becomes correction. But for those who refuse, who continue to deny, blame, and deflect, collapse deepens. The internal system continues to fail. Stability erodes, judgment weakens, and the consequences that follow are no longer subtle. Internal collapse is the point of no return for the narcissist who will not change. It marks the moment when the cost of avoidance outweighs the comfort of illusion. And once the inner structure gives way, the outer world soon follows. Because when a person cannot hold themselves together internally, life begins dismantling what they can no longer sustain. Stripped of blessings, when support is quietly withdrawn, when the inner structure has collapsed, life does not rush in with spectacle. It responds with withdrawal. This is the stage many misunderstand. They expect punishment to look dramatic, public downfall, visible humiliation, immediate ruin. But moral law often works differently. It removes what can no longer be entrusted. Blessings are not taken arbitrarily. They are recalled. Relationships begin to thin not out of cruelty, but discernment. People who once offered support now keep distance. Opportunities that once opened easily now close without explanation. Favor fades, protection lifts. This is not retaliation. It is correction through containment. In Christian understanding, blessings are not rewards for image, they are stewardship. And when stewardship is abused, when influence is used to manipulate, when trust is exploited, when grace is mistaken for entitlement, support is withdrawn to prevent further harm. The narcissist often interprets this phase as betrayal. They believe others have turned against them. But what has actually occurred is clarity. People see more clearly now. They are no longer confused, no longer persuaded by charm or explanation, and clarity changes behavior. Institutions protect themselves. Communities step back. Systems adjust. This stripping does not happen all at once. It happens layer by layer, Each loss is small enough to be explained away until the pattern becomes undeniable. A connection ends. A role is lost. A door closes. Not with anger, with finality. What makes this stage so destabilizing is its quiet nature. There is no one to argue with. No accusation to refute. No confrontation to win. Life simply stops cooperating. The narcissist may attempt to reclaim what was lost through apology, performance, or persuasion. But blessings that are withdrawn do not return through tactics. They return only through transformation. And transformation cannot be forced. This phase exposes a painful truth. Many of the narcissist's supports were conditional on illusion. When illusion collapsed, so did access. The very systems they relied on were never built to sustain distortion indefinitely. From a moral perspective, this is justice without spectacle. It protects the innocent. It limits damage. It restores order without requiring revenge. For the one who disengaged, this phase is often misunderstood as coincidence. They may not even be aware of what is happening on the other side. And that is precisely the point. Karma does not require your attention to function. It does not ask you to witness loss. It does not need you to validate consequence. It operates independently. This is where many finally understand that justice is not about watching someone fall. It is about being freed from the system that once trapped you. The stripping of blessings is not meant to destroy. It is meant to stop continuation, to end cycles that could not be corrected through warning or exposure. And when this withdrawal is complete, what remains is truth unprotected by charm, unsupported by influence, exposed to reality as it is. While blessings are withdrawn from one side, space is being cleared on the other for a life no longer entangled with manipulation. The core lesson. What Reckoning Day is really teaching you. Reckoning Day is not given so you can watch someone fall. It is given so you can finally understand how moral order works. This is the lesson many believers only learn later in life, often after years of confusion, endurance, and unanswered prayer. Justice is not a spectacle, and it does not require your participation to be complete. The greatest misconception about accountability is the belief that it must look dramatic to be real, that wrongdoers must confess publicly, that victims must be vindicated loudly, that closure requires confrontation. But moral law does not operate through performance. It operates through alignment. Reckoning Day teaches this first and most important truth. You were never responsible for enforcing justice. Your role was never to correct the narcissist, never to expose them, never to prove your innocence or their guilt. Your role was to withdraw from what violated order. And when you did, when you stopped reacting, explaining, pleading, or trying to be understood, you unknowingly stepped out of the system that protected their behavior. That withdrawal is not abandonment. It is obedience to truth. This is where many people struggle. They confuse silence with weakness, distance with failure, peace with denial. But Reckoning Day reveals the opposite. Silence is not surrender when truth no longer needs defense. Distance is not avoidance when boundaries restore order. Peace is not denial when chaos has lost access to you. The narcissist's reckoning did not begin because you fought back. It began because you stopped participating. This is the educational core of the entire process. Justice does not require you to stay entangled. It requires you to step out. Reckoning Day also teaches a second sobering truth. Consequences are not designed to satisfy observers. They are designed to stop harm. That is why they often unfold quietly. Why support is withdrawn instead of shame imposed. Why exposure happens without your presence. This is not injustice. This is restraint with purpose. For those rooted in faith, This is where trust is refined. You learn that God does not humiliate to teach. He corrects to restore order. He removes access before he allows destruction. And that restoration begins with you. What you gain from Reckoning Day is not the sight of someone else's loss, but the return of your own clarity. Your nervous system settles, your perception sharpens. Your sense of self no longer bends around someone else's instability. You learn discernment. You learn boundaries. You learn that love without truth is not love at all. Most importantly, you learn this final lesson. You do not need to witness judgment for it to be real. If your life is quieter now, if your mind is clearer, if your peace no longer depends on being believed, then justice has already been at work. Reckoning Day ends not when someone is ruined, but when you are released. Released from confusion, released from self-doubt, released from the false belief that evil must be confronted directly to be stopped. Moral order does not need an audience. It only needs alignment. And when alignment is restored, you are free to move forward, not hardened, not bitter, not triumphant, but grounded, wiser, and no longer available to what once harmed you. That is the real victory. That is the lesson. And that is how Reckoning Day completes its work.